Welcome to Sidactic. Today is Saturday, August 17th, 2024, and I am Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast about psychiatry and neuroscience. I make this as a way for me to have an excuse to nerd out and look more deeply into topics that I love to think about. By synthesizing and then writing and then recording something, I get to share it with you, for better or for worse. Everything in this episode and in every other episode is my opinion, unless someone else is talking and then it's their opinion. And even if it was someone else, it was curated by me with all of the biases inherent in the way that I think. This is not medical advice, and it's certainly not the opinion of any institution that I work with or for, or any person who happens to be standing next to me on the metro. Today, I'm going to discuss the term transference. And if you listen until the end, I'm going to relate it to some computational neuroscience. Woohoo! Transference is probably the most historically loaded term I have dealt with to date. Transference is supposed to be an unconscious process, so it cannot really be observed, only inferred. So this means that both the definition of transference and any instance of it in psychotherapy is dependent upon the therapist's model and their particular way of interpreting that model. But what exactly is this elusive but data-rich unconscious process? For some, especially nowadays, it's very broadly defined as basically the way that a patient relates to anyone based on their past experiences and relationships. But if you're Carl Jung, you might say that their transference includes something called the collective unconscious as a player, not just the patient's unconscious. In a more Freudian psychoanalytic approach, transference may be more strictly defined as something very deterministic. For example, the unconscious fantasies that a patient generates about their therapist. It might also be defined as the transfer onto the therapist of an object relationship that the patient has previously developed. Their most primary object is probably their parental object, and this may dovetail with more Freudian concepts like the Oedipus complex. Transference may also be defined as what the patient assumes that the therapist thinks or feels, based on whatever their psychopathology is. Psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapists use, as a primary way to evaluate their patient, their inferences of the patient's transference. While other therapies recognize in general that a patient's past can creep into the therapeutic relationship, most don't rely on identifying transference explicitly. So let's rewind back to the mid-1900s. And I'm going to talk about a paper called The Concept of Transference, and it was by a psychoanalyst named Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z. I'm not sure how you pronounce it actually. And it was in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And he reports on many different definitions of transference as they were available in 1963. So for example, he quotes Carl Menninger, who wrote in 1958, "I define transference as the unrealistic roles or identities unconsciously ascribed to a therapist by a patient in the regression of the psychoanalytic treatment and the patient's reactions to this representation derived from earlier experience." Wow, there's a lot of words in there. Szasz also quotes Ida McAlpine, who wrote in 1950, "Transference may be said to be an attempt of the patient to revive and reenact in the analytic situation and in relation to the analyst, situations and fantasies of his childhood. Hence, transference is a regressive process." Saz goes back even further to Gover from 1939 and quotes, "As the transference develops, feelings originally associated with parental figures are displaced to the analyst, and the analytic situation is reacted to as an infantile one." Now, all of these analytical definitions of transference rely on another concept called regression, and state that transference can be identified by the nature of a patient's regression toward a more infantile state that the patient experiences when they are in psychotherapy. Saz also explores transference as something that may transcend the therapeutic relationship. He explores how some analysts at that time had proposed that transference cannot be used to account for some, or possibly even most of the affective states that patients experience in therapy. For example, he quotes Finichl, Finichl, if you're wondering. I'm not sure how it is actually pronounced, but this is from 1941. So Finichl says, "Not everything is transference that is experienced by a patient in the form of affects and impulses during the course of an analytic treatment. If the analysis appears to make no progress, the patient has, in my opinion, the right to be angry, and his anger need not be a transference from childhood. Or rather, we will not succeed in demonstrating the transference component in it." Aside from relying on regression, or our patients' tendency to become more childlike when they're in therapy, transference as a means of formulating a patient uses what could be called a Bayes optimal approach, because it fits the data, the patient's actual behaviors, or what the therapist thinks is their affect, to a model that the therapist has. Now, Dr. O'Leary, now you sound like you're talking nonsense. What is a Bayes optimal approach? So this is where I get into a little bit of the neuroscience. So I'll get into more later, but let me summarize now like this. When we get new data, we can do two primary things with it. We can either change how we experience the world, what data we get from the world, or we can change what we think about the world, the model that we have about the world. A mathematical way to say this is that we can change our model to fit the data, or we can change the data to fit the model. When we have tightly defined and rigid models, then the easiest thing to do is to change the data to fit the model, and the easiest way to do this is to gather a lot of data and then just pick out of that data things that we think are patterns that appear to fit our model. So this is, at its core, a pseudo-scientific process, because it appears that our models are well supported by the data, but we're only considering the data that supports our model and not the data that doesn't. We're ignoring the rest. We are, in effect, then, changing the world to fit our model in order to become Bayes optimal. Maybe an easier way to conceptualize this is actually to imagine that your family just bought a used Toyota Prius. Suddenly, you're seeing Priuses everywhere you go, on the highway, in parking lots, at stoplights, and you may be tempted to think that this was not the case in the past. There weren't this many Priuses before I got one. But what has happened is not that there are suddenly more Priuses on the road. What has changed, or what has more likely changed, is that now the way you are sampling data in the world is different. But how does this relate to psychotherapy and transference? So let's just assume my model, Dr. O'Leary's model, states that the primary transference in a therapeutic relationship between a female patient of mine and me, the male psychotherapist, is one of sexual desire or envy for the power that the therapist holds in the relationship. One of those two things. The primary love object of my female patient is the patient's father, who she can't have due to society's restrictions on having sex with your dad, so she must transfer that desire onto someone else in order to have it be fulfilled. I am an adequate substitute, but I'm also similarly elusive. A sexual relationship between me, the provider, and my patient is forbidden. This recapitulates the relationship with her father. The vehicle of this transference is the patient's unconscious fantasy of sexual intercourse with me, which at some point during therapy will likely percolate to the surface and ultimately come to conscious awareness. But long before the patient realizes this, me, or I, as the therapist, should have already inferred its existence. At the point the patient reveals this realization, I will be confirmed that my inference of transference was true. I will see a Prius where I might not have before. Now, for those of you who either already knew or who have quickly figured out that transference is not necessarily a one-way street, the complement to transference is counter-transference, which is a similar phenomenon, though it's supposed to be based on the therapist's unconscious fantasies regarding the patient. I might desire the patient and have fantasies of breaking free from society's restrictions and eloping with her. I might alternatively view the patient as my daughter and then be unconsciously willing to adjust my actions to protect and nurture her instead of to maybe challenge and expose her to opportunities to gain power either in this relationship, the therapeutic relationship, or in the relationship with the world at large. I might convince her to take a more passive stance because I want to protect her, because she is like a daughter to me. In the past, the roots of transference were proposed to be highly deterministic, and a particular type of transference had a strict relationship with the kind of disorder a patient presented with. For example, Freud had noticed that many of his female patients, especially those determined to be hysterical, reported having been raped by family members or having had inappropriate sexual relationships in the past. And because so many of them had similar disturbing stories, he decided to reject the idea that any or most of them were actually sexually molested. They must be inventing these tales, and therefore the sexual fantasies are the cause of their hysteria. He later waffled on this idea, proposing that maybe some kind of actual sexual activity might have occurred, but instead of molestation, it was more likely to be masturbation. Patients are causing their own hysterical or neurotic reactions by a failure to suppress their sexual urges and just giving in to their fantasies. The sexual fantasies of the patient toward the therapist served to prove this. He revised his ideas many times over his life, but the primacy of using transference in this exact same way to determine the cause of neurosis remained central to the psychoanalytic method and is often used like that today. But in our more modern age, loosey-goosey definitions of transference and countertransference are more often used. So in general, those without intense formal training in psychoanalysis or psychodynamics, well, people like me, use the word transference to mean basically just the baggage that a patient brings with them to therapy that affects the way they relate to the therapist. I was really drawn to a quote I found in a paper from 2007 in the American Journal of Psychotherapy, and I think it does a better job than I can do in explaining this. So this is from The Role of Clinical Inference in Psychoanalytic Case Formulation, published in 2007 by David Wolitsky. In the current age of theoretical pluralism, we can no longer speak of the theory of psychoanalysis. We have increasingly accepted the notion that when formulating a case, the clinician creates a narrative structure influenced by a preferred theoretical orientation. This structure is an attempt to provide a coherent, comprehensive, plausible, and hopefully accurate account of the individual's personality and current functioning based on his or her life story. as that history is told, lived, and retold by the patient and analyst in the course of the psychoanalytic encounter. Implicit in this view is that what we call facts in psychoanalysis are not pure observations, but inferences that attribute meanings and motives to patients' behaviors and experiences. What is observed, i.e., what is attended to selectively, stored, and retrieved from memory to arrive at particular clinical inferences, is influenced by the nature of the patient-therapist interaction, including the therapist's countertransference reactions and working model of the patient, which is active and changes as new material is produced. It is inevitable that what the therapist selects for observation and the inferences drawn from the observations are influenced by theory. Long ago, it was observed by Marmer, 1974, that Freudian patients have Freudian dreams and Jungian patients have Jungian dreams. Now, this pluralistic view might just be a nice way of saying that psychoanalysts or psychodynamic psychotherapists interpret transferences in any case basically entirely arbitrarily. And I don't mean arbitrary like in the colloquial meaning, which is basically just randomly generated, but in the sense that the therapist is an arbiter and determines which preconceived models apply to this patient. While this way of doing things is a non-random process, it's not arbitrary in the random way, the model is not actually selected from all possible models based on the data. So a therapist doesn't take the data and then generate any infinite number or finite number, but large number of models that might fit the data and then find the one that fits it the best. In this way, data is not actually generating a hypothesis, but it's just combed through for evidence that appears to fit a limited number of already assumed possible sets of explanations. Whatever convenient model fits the data is selected, whether it's a Prius or a Camry. It's not a passive process. The data that we get because we have, to some degree, forced that data into existence, and then forced it to fit a predetermined model because the data that we collect is collected only because it reminds us of that model. Everything else is unimportant, random noise. So it might be tempting to say that our more modern eclectic approaches, which allow for model switching, is a method that fits the model to the data. But all it really does is sift through a larger number of arbitrary narratives. Therapy basically assumes at the outset that the patient starts either lacking insight into their problems or having deceived themselves as to the source of their problem. All of the various therapeutic frameworks seek to disabuse the patient of their ignorance or self-deception. And the dynamic and analytic ones assume that the formulation is determined by the therapist, who is attuned to transference, countertransference. None of these models derive their explanatory narrative from the data itself, but instead find patterns in the patient's narrative that fit the story that the therapist wants to tell back to the patient. The transference they identify is the transference they are looking for. When we see details that fit a familiar story, we focus on these. Now, to be fair, this is not an entirely wrong way to do this. It's just a very limited way of understanding our patient. It would be extremely resource intense to generate a new model for every new patient. We need some kinds of predetermined models to guide our work, at least ideas or methods that guide our work. Psychotherapy happens to be flush with competing models. Confirming our own suspicions is very satisfying, and it's an attractive way to think. And I know that I think like this very frequently as a clinician because It's convenient for me. It helps me make decisions. I can move on. I can do something and then move on to the next decision. I can see that the patient is, for example, regressing into a more childlike state and relying on me as their parent to prescribe them an anxiolytic because I, too, am distressed by their anxious presentation. It's an easy thinking trap to fall into. And in some cases, it has some level of validity. Not all our models are just completely like random. Some of them have some level of validity. And it can be argued that any good story that promotes adaptive behaviors will help a patient to exert more control over their lives or to release the pathological amount of control that they are desperately clinging to. One of the ways that many modern physicians deal with the plethora of theoretical frameworks is by, well, just not necessarily attempting to explain why any particular patient is anxious or depressed or obsessive, etc., but merely treating the patient because they are anxious or depressed or obsessive or whatever. You're depressed. And there are studies that show that we can do something about this. We have effective treatments. So here is an antidepressant, and I'm going to refer you for a round of cognitive behavioral therapy. If you do both, you'll have about a 40 to 60% chance of feeling significantly better than by just waiting for it to go away. It is an impersonal approach, but it's arguably efficient. I mean, there's no need for 104 weekly sessions to wait for the patient to reveal their life themes and transference and to work through that. In the more modern perspective, identifying an etiology or a cause is not necessary for their treatment. If we can identify the symptoms, we have some things that have been shown to relieve those symptoms. There are also a lot of other models, sometimes people call them biological models, for why people feel a certain way, like, for example, their genetic predisposition, some kind of chemical imbalance, some sort of functional neurological problem, or a trauma reaction, and we can use these to justify whatever we do. The worst outcome of this, just kind of arbitrarily picking our justification, is not that the therapist will make poorly evidenced conclusions, it's that our methods systematically blind us to all of the other possible interpretations of the data, and also blind us to the data itself because we only see what we're trained to see. Classical psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approaches rely on a relatively deterministic model of human cognition and behavior, where we can draw strong causal relationships through time and weave a narrative that's so satisfying, we don't even need to look anywhere else. But psychoanalysts are not the only ones who do this. Those of us preaching chemical imbalances are doing the same thing. It's just a different story. Modern psychodynamic approaches are less attached to a particular theoretical framework and will not try to, say, dramatically overfit the data to a single model. However, our overall approach in any psychotherapy has a limited number of models that data can be fit to. Transference, how we assume the patient relates to the world, is often still a key to determining which of these models we choose to use to explain the patient. But before I stop blabbering today, I want to relate this to some neuroscience. Most of our therapies are to some degree an expression of neuroscience as it was understood at the time that it was written. So like, for example, ideas like neurasthenia or exhaustion of the nerves had a great impact on people when Freud was thinking, and probably influenced Freud and why he identified things like masturbation as pathogenic. So did his rudimentary understanding of like evolutionary biology at the time, which supposed that humans shared with animals these basic drives that are necessarily dysfunctional in psychopathology, but are necessary in evolution to produce progeny and carry on the species. But until recently, much of neuroscience merely assumed that the different functions of the brain are anatomically distinct from each other. For example, emotions are a function of the limbic system, anxiety, particularly of the amygdala, and cognition is in the cortex, etc. But the most advanced data now does not support this at all. Some have even called this kind of a modern form of phrenology. And phrenology is just a debunked form of psychological inference where doctors used to claim to be able to determine things like people's personality traits by feeling their skull anatomy. They could even do this for dead people. Neuroscientists are showing more and more that degeneracy of neurological processes is really the norm. What I mean by this is that our expressions of things like anger, contentment, anxiety, joy, etc., are not generated in the same way over time. The brain patterns that supposedly are the fingerprint of happiness on an MRI are actually really hard to reproduce, even within a single person, and especially divergent among separate individuals. What causes most complex experiential phenomenon like this is not just one thing. It is degenerate. It has a multitude of things that are subjectively interpreted as the same thing. There are many paths to feeling happy, even in your brain. I highly encourage you to check out the Brain Science podcast. It's called Brain Science Podcast by Dr. Ginger Campbell, especially episode 135 with Dr. Lisa Barrett, who describes how she was forced to give up the idea that there are reliable neurological tracings for how emotions are generated in the brain. This may be because there are, in fact, an infinite number of Bayes optimal ways, I'm going to use that word again, an infinite number of Bayes optimal ways to produce a belief that maximizes free energy or an emotion that does the same thing. I mean, emotions at their most fundamental level are really beliefs, or they are tendencies toward beliefs about the state of the world. Holy schmagoli, Dr. O, what's happening here? So I hope that I've piqued your interest by using crazy words like Bayes optimal. But instead of doing a poor job of explaining how Bayes optimal solutions relate to psychotherapy, I'm going to provide you with links to 2 episodes of a podcast called Doorknob Comments. The first is an interview with neurophysicist Dr. Carl Friston, who's one of the main developers and proponents of something called active inference and the free energy principle. The second is an interview with Dr. Alexei Tolchinsky, where he discusses the narrative fallacy. Dr. Tolchinsky was also on this podcast a few episodes ago talking about the same thing, the narrative fallacy. Now, in the future, you'll hear me come back to this concept of active inference, Bayes optimization, and the free energy principle frequently. These principles, I believe, unify neuroscience and psychology and cognitive philosophies, and can even provide a much more fundamental way to understand sciences like evolutionary biology. And they do this by basically modeling a common thread in how various processes, for example, like natural selection, will work, or processes like how our brain will select for different neurons as it's pruning itself. Bayes optimization can even help to explain why patients act the way that they do, and it doesn't do it by making any assumptions about their daddy issues. Thank you for listening. I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic.